Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. We're back. It's Deborah Evans, LLG's Chief Executive, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
So it seems hot off the government's very positive announcement around standards and sanctions for councillors. The Committee on Standards in Public Life is once again reminding us about the Nolan principles. Dennis.
Well, yes, it's 30 years since the Nolan principles emerged, and Committee on Standards Chair Doug Chalmers has things to say about Nolan's golden threads and the government's proposals for a new commission. Chalmers reminds us that in the Committee on Standards' first report in 1995, Lord Nolan said that 3 golden threads were applicable right across all public life in order to maintain high standards. The first of these, all public bodies should have a code of conduct incorporating the 7 principles of public life. Second, internal systems for maintaining standards should be supported by independent scrutiny. Third and finally, more needs to be done to promote and reinforce standards of conduct in public bodies, and in particular through guidance and training. Now, in 2021, Chalmers said that the committee reviewed the now complex standards landscape to evaluate its strengths and weaknesses and to evaluate the effectiveness of standards regulation. The committee then made recommendations for reform in central government, calling for stronger rules, greater independence, and a more rigorous compliance function to restore confidence in the regulation of standards. The Labour government is today committed to setting up an independent Ethics and Integrity Commission. But in Chalmers' opinion, the detail on what that new body would do was limited both before the election and in their manifesto, so it is hard to assess whether it will ease or add to the complexity of the standards landscape. Now, the third golden thread, education, is one that Chalmers is particularly keen to promote. But Chalmers poses this question. Right across the public sector, we find the Nolan principles written in codes and on lanyards. But are we making the space for staff to discuss ethics and standards regularly enough? Knowing what doing the right thing is can be complicated at times, and nurturing organizational values and expectations takes time, but is an essential part of leadership in the public sector if the public interest is to be properly served. So here's the question. Is your council giving you the space to discuss standards and ethics?
Well, it's a very good question indeed, Dennis, and one that I hope our listeners will take on board. And we do know that there are many excellent examples across local authorities of open governance. But we also know that the reverse is true, and you only have to look at intervention reports to see that. But if I could just point everybody who's listening in the direction of our recently launched Code of Practice on Good Governance for hints and tips on how to do that. So following on from this topic, the Prime Minister has last week updated the Ministerial Code, which sets out the standards expected in public life when serving the British people for ministers. Now, changes to the code include enshrining the 7 principles of public life, strengthening the powers of the PM's independent advisor, new guiding principles for ministers on gifts and hospitality, and new rules to align the publication of ministerial gifts and hospitality more closely with the parliamentary register. Now, new principles provide clearer standards on gifts and hospitality. The code now specifies that ministers have a responsibility to represent the government, engage with stakeholders, and support relevant sectors of the UK economy. Now, these responsibilities will require ministers to attend functions and events in a ministerial capacity, including those where hospitality may be offered. However, it is a well-established and recognised rule that ministers should not accept any gifts, hospitality or service which would or might reasonably appear to compromise their judgment or indeed place them under an obligation to people or organisations that might try inappropriately to influence their work in government. Now, the new rules will require the government to publish ministerial declarations of hospitality and gifts on a monthly basis rather than quarterly at present, and to include the value of hospitality received. However, the new code makes no changes to the rules around post-government jobs or how those rules are enforced. Ministers can't lobby the government for 2 years after they leave office, and they must follow advice from the Independent Advisory Committee on Business Appointments about any roles they wish to take up within this period. Neither have changes to the recording or publication of ministers' external meetings, although in 2023, the previous government tentatively committed to moving this to a monthly publication, but the Labour government has retained that as quarterly. Now, in entirely other news, powers to combat antisocial behaviour have been through many changes since the Antisocial Behaviour Act of 2003, but it can be challenging to navigate, especially when it involves the act of begging, which itself has been an offence for 2 centuries under the Vagrancy Act. Dennis, what can you tell us?
Well, as you know, council legal teams regularly have to deal with the legislation concerning antisocial behaviour, and a recent Court of Appeal case gave useful guidance to practitioners on how to apply the law to these situations. The case of Swindon Borough Council and Aybrook concerns antisocial behaviour for the purposes of Part 1 of the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act 2014, but in the context of begging. And the Court of Appeal held that, first, a distinction between aggressive and passive begging is not a helpful argument to make, as was pointed out in this case. It should not be substituted for the statutory test in the legislation. Second, the fact that the impugned conduct falls within the statutory definition is not enough. The court must also be satisfied that it is just and convenient to make an order. Third, a power of arrest should not be attached to an order as a matter of course. And fourth and finally, applicants must observe the restrictions on without notice applications and interim junctions. Now, those were the technical points, the key technical points for practitioners in the case, but what about the outcome of the case itself? Well, Swindon Borough Council successfully appealed against a decision by a district judge to discharge an antisocial behaviour injunction which prohibited begging. And the court confirmed that begging may well satisfy the statutory definition, provided it causes, or indeed is likely to cause, harassment, alarm, and distress. And the judgment further confirmed that the county court has no jurisdiction to discharge these orders of its own initiative without an application by one of the parties. Deborah.
Thank you, Dennis. And for practitioners working in this field who'd like to read that judgment, click on the link in last week's bulletin. Now, the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee has launched its first inquiry of this Parliament to examine the experiences of children and families in temporary accommodation and consider how temporary housing could be improved. Now, the cross-party inquiry is going to scrutinise issues around the quality of temporary accommodation provision, and then balance that with the pressures on local authority finances in England. Now, the inquiry will consider how children and families in temporary accommodation could be better supported by government, local authorities and accommodation providers. Now, Florence Eshalomi, who's the chair of the committee, said the housing crisis means that families are increasingly being housed in substandard temporary accommodation, meaning children may spend years living in places which are just not suitable or adequate to grow up in. Now, growing demand for accommodation is also impacting council finances, as we all know, with local authorities seeing already desperately tight budgets further stretched by ever increasing temporary housing costs. So the committee's inquiry is going to consider the impact of temporary accommodation on children's development, health and well-being, housing quality in temporary accommodation. It's going to look at the use of B&Bs and other unsuitable temporary accommodation. And it's also going to consider how the government, local authorities and accommodation providers could better support children and families living in temporary accommodation. Now, the committee began this inquiry with an opening evidence session last Tuesday with homelessness organisations and local authority stakeholders, including Crisis and St Mungo's, and also the District Councils Network and London Councils. Now, they're going to be examining issues regarding the experiences of children and families. Now, MPs are likely to ask questions around homelessness prevention, because clearly prevention is always the best way forward. They're also going to look at quality, as we've said before, but balancing that with the financial pressure on councils. And they're expected to examine the placing of families in B&B and local authorities' use of out-of-area placements and the impact of the accommodation on health and development. Now, the committee is expected to wrap up this short inquiry with questions to a government minister in the new year. So, Dennis, data protection is of continuing concern and importance, and we have a new data bill in Parliament, I understand.
Yes, indeed. The government is set to introduce new data laws aimed at streamlining administrative tasks for frontline workers and improving public services. The Data Use and Access Bill will unlock the secure and effective use of data for the public interest, according to a government statement announcing the new bill. The government says that the bill's key measures include cutting down on bureaucracy for police officers, freeing up 1.5 million hours of their time a year, and changes will simplify important tasks such as renting a flat and starting work with trusted ways to verify identity online. Of especial interest to local authorities, the bill will also modernise the registration of deaths in England and Wales from a paper-based system to an electronic birth and death register. Now, these reforms will enable registrations which are required by local authorities to be carried out over the phone, removing the need for face-to-face registration while retaining that choice. The measures will be underpinned by a revamped Information Commissioner's Office with a new structure and powers of enforcement. The government said that safeguards will remain in place to track and monitor how personal data is used. Information Commissioner John Edwards welcomed the introduction of the bill in the House of Lords, and he said, "This is an important piece of legislation which will allow my office to continue to operate as a trusted, fair and independent regulator and provide certainty for all organisations as they innovate and promote the UK economy." Deborah.
Well, finally from me, the local government lawyer noted that inspections by the Regulator of Social Housing against its new consumer standards introduced last April has seen Barnsley Metropolitan Borough Council become the first local authority to receive a C1 grading. So well done to them. Now, 7 social landlords received judgments with Sandwell Council given a C3 grading, meaning it had failed to meet the standards and would need to make significant improvements. And last month, the London Borough of Newham was handed a C4 grade, the lowest possible, meaning there are very serious failings and fundamental changes are needed. But back to Barnsley, where Councillor Robin Franklin, who's their cabinet spokesperson for Regen and Culture, said, "We're incredibly proud that we've received such a positive result and that we're the first local authority to be graded a C1. Now, this outcome gives us a really good sense of what's going well and reflects our dedication to improving housing services, providing safe and warm homes and putting our tenants at the heart of everything we do. However, while we celebrate this milestone, we're not complacent and we know there are still areas where we can and will improve, working with tenants and partners to get the best for Barnsley." Now, Kate Dodsworth, who's the Chief of Regulatory Engagement at the Regulator, said, "Even when a landlord has been awarded a C1 grading, there's always room for improvement. Our governance and financial viability standards remain as important as ever. Landlords need to keep a tight grip on identifying and mitigating risks to avoid problems now and later down the line." Now, the Regulator's 2024 Sector Risk Profile, published last month, sets out its view on the most significant sources of risk to landlords' ongoing compliance with our regulatory standards. Now, you won't be surprised to learn that financial viability was identified as a concern, but other concerns mentioned included health and safety, the quality of existing stock, which I know is a concern to many councils. Delivering services to tenants can obviously be compromised by resource levels. Data integrity and cyber security was mentioned. Costs and access to skilled labour can be tricky. Rent setting, rental income and rental arrears. Supported housing was raising questions, and construction process risk and fraud. And the regulator states that it is for boards and councillors to set their organisation's strategic direction and priorities whilst delivering the outcomes required by the standards. Now, a lack of strategic direction can, as we all know, prevent important decisions being taken. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on this, the items discussed today, and many, many more besides by going to bulletin number 42, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
And have a good week.